25 medieval facts you probably didn't know. The Middle Ages were a time of social transformation, as Europe took shape under the influence of power struggles, church authority, and constant warfare that reshaped the political and cultural map of the world. Although often perceived as a dark era marked by instability, famine, and plague, it also brought significant advancements in architecture, philosophy, and education, laying the foundations for future development. Society was rigidly structured. While the nobility ruled and peasants worked their lands, knightly honor, feudal obligations, and the strong influence of monasteries shaped daily life across all social classes. And if this period intrigues you, we've prepared 25 fascinating facts about the Middle Ages that you probably didn't know, some of which may surprise or astonish you with their bizarreness and unbelievable nature. The Middle Ages are traditionally seen as the period in European history between the fall of antiquity and the beginning of the modern era. Its beginning is most often linked to the fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 AD, while its end is dated variously, for example, with the fall of Constantinople in 1453, the discovery of America by Christopher Columbus in 1492, or Martin Luther's publication of the 95 Theses in 1517. This roughly 1,000-year-long period is usually divided into three main phases: the Early Middle Ages, 5th to 11th centuries, the High Middle Ages, 11th to 14th centuries, and the Late Middle Ages, 14th to 15th centuries. During the Early Middle Ages, new centers of civilization began to form, gradually shifting from the Mediterranean to inland Europe. This era was marked by the spread of Christianity and the development of Romanesque art and architecture. The High Middle Ages saw significant cultural, economic, and political growth. Crusades were launched, and majestic Gothic cathedrals were built. The Late Middle Ages then represented the transition to the modern age, accompanied by major social and technological changes. In the Middle Ages, it was not completely uncommon for animals to be put on trial just like humans. They were assigned moral responsibility for their actions, which led to bizarre court proceedings. In 1457, in the French town of Savigny, a sow and her 6 piglets were accused of killing a 5-year-old boy named Jehan Martin. The trial was carried out with full seriousness, including judges, prosecutors, and witnesses. In the end, the sow was found guilty and sentenced to be hanged, while the piglets were acquitted due to their young age and a lack of evidence of complicity. Trials of animals were far from rare in the Middle Ages, as shown by many historical records. Animals were accused not only of murder and attacks, but also of property damage. In 1474, for instance, a rooster in Basel was sentenced to be burned for laying an egg, something considered proof of his connection with the devil. Another example is the sow from Fontenay-aux-Roses, which killed a small child in 1266 and was sentenced to death, while her piglets again escaped punishment due to insufficient evidence. Besides executions, animals were sometimes even excommunicated. In 1120, the church in Lyon officially excommunicated caterpillars and field mice for allegedly destroying crops. Although today these trials seem absurd, medieval society perceived animals differently. Their actions were judged from moral and religious standpoints. It was only with the advent of rational thinking during Renaissance and younger periods that these practices were gradually abandoned and became more of a historical curiosity than a serious legal matter. In the Middle Ages, salt was an extremely valuable commodity. It was used not only as a seasoning, but also as the primary method of food preservation, ensuring longer shelf life in an age without refrigeration. Its high price was due to the difficulty of extraction and limited availability, which led to it often being referred to as white gold. Pepper was seen as a luxury item. Its price was driven up by the long and dangerous trade routes from India to Europe. Each link in the supply chain raised the cost. For example, in India, 1 kilogram of pepper cost 1 to 2 grams of silver, while in Europe, buyers would regularly pay 20 to 30 grams of silver for the same amount, a markup of up to 30 times. Sugar was likewise extremely expensive and rare, often considered a medicine and sold in apothecaries. Its high cost limited its availability to only the wealthiest classes. The steep prices of these goods meant they were sometimes used as currency or as part of ransom payments. For example, when the Visigoth king Alaric I besieged Rome in 408 AD, one of his ransom demands included 1,250 kilograms of pepper. In medieval England, regular archery practice was mandatory for every able-bodied man. This was established by King Henry III of England in his 1252 proclamation known as the Assize of Arms, which required every man aged 15 to 60 to own a bow and arrows. In 1363, his successor Edward III expanded this requirement and ordered archery practice every Sunday and on holidays, ensuring a constant supply of trained archers for the kingdom's defense. English longbowmen played a crucial role in several major battles, for example at French Crécy in 1346, where their rapid and accurate volleys devastated the numerically superior French forces. Similarly, at the Battle of Poitiers in 1356, their skills inflicted heavy losses on the French nobility and led to the capture of King John II of France. The obligation to train in archery not only improved England's military readiness, but also contributed to the development of archery as a national tradition, having a long-term impact on English culture and identity. Although for some people today football is a key part of life, in medieval England, this ball game was often banned due to its violent nature and potential to cause public disorder. For example, on April 13th, 1314, King Edward II banned football in London under pressure from merchants, citing the noise, chaos, and rioting the game caused. Medieval football, known as mob football, had no limit on the number of players. Entire villages or parishes often joined in, trying to bring the ball to a pre-designated place like a church or manor house. Rules were minimal and violence was common. Players punched, kicked, and sometimes even used weapons, resulting in frequent injuries and deaths. In 1321, for instance, a football riot in Cornwall led to the deaths of 39 people. Despite repeated bans, football survived due to its popularity among the people and eventually evolved into a more organized sport with formal rules, leading to the founding of the Football Association in 1863, and the modern game as we know it today. Although forks date back to ancient Greece, their regular use probably spread only during the Byzantine Empire, from where the utensil gradually made its way into European countries. In the 11th century, forks began to appear in Italy, especially thanks to the popularity of pasta, which was easier to eat with their help, contributing to their gradual adoption in the region. Despite this, forks were viewed negatively in many parts of Europe. Some writers from the Roman Catholic Church condemned them, arguing that God gave man fingers as natural tools, and replacing them with metal instruments was seen as an insult. In England, forks started to be used only in the 16th century and slowly became part of the dining experience. Still, it took several decades before they became a standard part of cutlery. Interestingly, even in the 17th century, some monarchs, such as French King Louis XIV, still preferred to eat with their hands, despite cutlery being widely used at his court. In the Middle Ages, books were rare and costly because each one had to be copied by hand, a time-consuming process usually carried out by monks in monastery scriptoria. These monks spent days, months, or even years meticulously copying texts, often by candlelight, leading to fatigue and the occasional error. Transcribing manuscripts was a privilege reserved for the most experienced monks, who had to master both handwriting and language to ensure the most accurate copies possible. Despite all this care, errors did happen, and some had serious consequences. One of the most famous transcription mistakes involved omitting the word "not" in the Ten Commandments, turning "thou shalt not kill" into "thou shalt kill." Books were valuable not only due to the labor involved, but also because of the cost of materials like parchment and the artistic embellishments, which made each book a treasured artifact. In the 12th century, London had an estimated population of 18,000 to 20,000 people. By the early 14th century, that number had increased to around 100,000. This dramatic growth led to overcrowding in a city squeezed between the old Roman walls and the River Thames, severely worsening living conditions. Overpopulation and inadequate infrastructure caused serious hygiene problems, contributing to the spread of diseases, including the plague in the 14th century, which killed about 1/3 of London's population. Despite these challenges, London became a major centre of trade and craft, and its population growth reflected its rising economic and political importance in medieval England. This demographic shift also spurred the development of urban institutions and self-governance, laying the foundation for the modern city we know today. Starting in the 1330s, shoes with ridiculously long pointed toes, known as poulains or krakows, became fashionable in Europe. They were named after Krakow, Poland, where the trend supposedly originated. These shoes were especially popular among the aristocracy, with points sometimes extending 50% longer than the actual foot, a sign of high fashion. To maintain their shape, the toes were often stuffed with materials like moss or horsehair, which made them firm and visually appealing, though harder to make. In England, the style gained traction after King Richard II married Anne of Bohemia in 1382, spreading krakows to the English court. The extreme length made walking and kneeling difficult, attracting criticism from both the church and society. In 1463, a law was passed in England limiting toe length to just 2 inches, around 5 centimeters. Despite the controversy, krakows remained popular into the 1480s, when they were replaced by broad-toed duckbill shoes. Toilets and latrines have been around since ancient times, with the first documented examples dating back to the 5th century BC, when advanced sewer systems were developed. In ancient Greece and Rome, toilets were often part of public bathhouses. Roman public latrines featured open benches with holes, under which water flowed to carry away waste. In the Middle Ages, castle toilets, known as privies, were designed so that waste dropped down a chute, either outside the castle walls or into the moat. This often caused terrible smells and hygiene issues. Another solution was carrying waste away from the castle altogether, a dirty and thankless job that carried a social stigma. The simplest option, of course, was to build your castle on a seaside cliff or by a river, letting gravity and water take care of everything. In the English monarchy, there was an official role known as the Groom of the Stool, a personal servant whose duty was to assist the king with his hygiene, including his visits to the toilet. This role originated in the 15th century and became highly prestigious during the Tudor era because it granted intimate access to the monarch and influence over court affairs. Responsibilities included caring for the king's mobile toilet, known as a close stool, and keeping records of his bodily functions for the royal physician. The role required immense trust, as the attendant was privy to the most personal aspects of the king's life and could thus influence his decisions and enjoy a privileged position at court. During Henry VIII's reign, the job became even more important. The king often appointed his closest friends or powerful nobles to the position. These attendants were handsomely rewarded, sometimes receiving clothes worn by the king, and were entrusted with managing the royal household finances, giving them great power and wealth. One of the most notable grooms of the stool was Sir Anthony Denny, who had access to the king's private chambers and even held the royal seal, allowing him to sign documents on the king's behalf. Under the Stuart dynasty, the role was renamed Groom of the Stool, where stole referred to clothing, expanding the role to include care of the royal wardrobe. Nevertheless, the duties involving the king's personal hygiene remained part of the job, showing how significant the position continued to be. The role was eventually abolished in the early 19th century as social norms and technologies evolved, modernizing the royal household and doing away with such intimate positions. In medieval England, especially during the 10th century, eels served as a significant form of currency. One record, for instance, notes that land at an abbey in Fens was leased for 26,275 eels. This practice was particularly common in eastern England, where marshlands provided ideal habitats for an abundance of eels, making them both a local delicacy and a valued commodity. Eels were especially valuable during religious fasting periods when the church forbade meat, but not eels, thereby increasing their importance. By the 14th century, the use of eels as currency began to decline, likely due to the increased circulation of coinage, or a decrease in eel populations caused by overfishing or climate changes. Courtly love was a medieval literary concept in which a knight yearned for an idealized and often unattainable lady, for whom he was willing to perform heroic deeds, whether writing poetry or embarking on wild adventures. This concept emerged in the late 11th century at aristocratic courts in Aquitaine, Provence, Champagne, Burgundy, and the Norman Kingdom of Sicily. It blended erotic desire with spiritual aspiration and was seen as both illicit and morally uplifting, passionate yet disciplined, humiliating and deeply human. Since most medieval marriages were arranged for financial or political gain rather than affection, courtly love allowed nobles to express romantic feelings outside their marital bonds. Couples could dance, laugh, and even hold hands, but physical intimacy was strictly forbidden and reserved only for lawful spouses. During the medieval period in England, culinary traditions were often extravagant. One such delicacy involved stuffing birds with other birds, creating elaborate layered dishes. These were known as game pies and were particularly favoured by the nobility and upper classes. This tradition continued into the early modern period. In the 18th century, for example, a pie might contain a pigeon stuffed into a partridge, then into a chicken, then a goose, and finally into a turkey, creating a complex and costly feast. William Hutton's 1816 autobiography describes a dish made by his grandmother that layered a goose, duck, chicken, partridge, and pigeon inside one another. Such pies were not only food, but also a spectacle of wealth and entertainment. At a 1343 banquet in honor of Pope Clement VI, a castle-shaped pie was served with baked birds forming the walls, and inside were roasted deer, boars, goats, hares, and rabbits. Medieval literature featured poetic jewels where troubadours exchanged verses in a lyrical debate. These were known as tenso, partimen, and tournaemen. A tenso was a dialogue between two poets debating a subject. A partimen began with a question from one poet and a response from the other. The tournaemen was a competitive genre often involving three or more poets who debated in verse. The first known three-way tenso was by Rimbaud de Vaqueras with Adhemar de Paetus and Perdigon. These extended debates became known as tournaemens and were popular at poetry contests like the Floral Games and Puys. They can be seen as early forerunners to modern rap battles, with verbal duels and creative wordplay at their core. In medieval England, itinerant musicians were often viewed as vagabonds or thieves, resulting in their low social standing and limited hospitality. While they performed at feasts and celebrations for the nobility, they were not allowed to stay in the manor afterward and were instead sent to sleep in stables or barns. Under King Henry VIII, England developed a secret service that dispatched agents to important European courts to spy on foreign rulers. A common cover for these spies was posing as painters. By painting portraits of European nobles, they could hide messages in the artwork and gain access to the elite without suspicion. This method allowed for discreet intelligence gathering, while providing spies with a plausible reason to be in influential circles. Gargoyles, often shaped like terrifying creatures, decorated medieval churches not just as ornaments, but also as functional rainspouts, diverting water away from the stonework. Their use dates back to ancient Egypt and Greece, but they became widespread in Europe with the rise of Gothic architecture around 1200. Beyond their practical purpose, gargoyles were believed to ward off evil spirits and remind people of the ever-present threat of sin, strengthening religious devotion. For instance, St. Vitus Cathedral in Prague features over 130 gargoyles, although only 4 are medieval originals. The rest were added during the later completion of the cathedral. Gargoyles symbolized guardians of sacred spaces, intended to protect both the faithful and the structures themselves. In medieval England, punishments for criminals often involved public humiliation, including wearing shameful masks or badges that symbolized their offenses. Someone convicted of perjury, for instance, might be forced to wear a badge with 2 red tongues to indicate their guilt. Though such punishments seem harsh by today's standards, they served as effective deterrents and helped maintain social order at the time. In the 13th century, a Franciscan monk and scholar named Roger Bacon became famous for his revolutionary ideas and emphasis on experimental science. In his work Epistola de Secretis Operibus Artis et Naturae et de Nullitate Magiae, he predicted technological advancements that were unimaginable in his time. He described carts that could move without animal power and at great speeds, essentially predicting automobiles. He also wrote of flying machines with artificial wings controlled by a seated person, foreshadowing airplanes. Bacon's visions included submarines, diving suits, steamships, and telescopes, all demonstrating his extraordinary foresight. His ideas were so advanced that some of his contemporaries suspected him of practicing magic. Bacon's writings had a major impact on later scientific thought and laid the foundations of modern science. When the Normans invaded England in 1066, they introduced the system of surnames. Before this, people there typically used only one name, often leading to confusion. With surnames, nicknames based on physical traits or personal characteristics became common, like Richard Red for someone with red hair. If someone's appearance changed, so could their surname. For example, if Richard went bald, he might become Richard Ball, since ball meant bald in early English. Eventually, surnames became hereditary and passed from fathers to children, forming family names and enabling the tracing of lineage. In the Middle Ages, being knighted was a significant rite of passage, symbolizing a young man's acceptance into the elite warrior class. The ceremony began with a ritual bath, representing spiritual and bodily purification. This was followed by an all-night vigil at the altar, with the knight-to-be kneeling in full armor before his weapons, signifying devotion to knightly duties. The next morning, he dressed in symbolic colors, a white tunic for purity, a red cloak for blood, and black or brown stockings to symbolize returning to the earth after death. He received his sword and spurs, and the central ritual, the dubbing, took place when a sword was lightly tapped on his shoulders, and the words, "Be thou a knight," were spoken. Although technically any knight could perform the ceremony, for example in Bohemia, it was usually conducted by the king or his representative. The earliest recorded knighting in Bohemian lands took place in 1297 during the coronation of Wenceslaus II, who knighted 240 men. In the 13th century, knights wore enclosed helmets called great helms that covered their faces, making identification difficult in battle. This led to the development of heraldry. Each knight was given a unique coat of arms displayed on his shield, banner, or surcoat. This helped both allies and enemies recognize individuals on the battlefield. Over time, these symbols became important in law, governance, and society, symbolizing a noble's identity and territorial claims. In May 1306, King Edward I of England hosted the Grand Feast of the Swans, during which 267 men were knighted, including his son, the future Edward II. The ceremony was part of preparations for a campaign against the Scots led by Robert the Bruce, who had declared himself king after murdering John Comyn. Edward I knighted his son, who then knighted the remaining 266 men. At the feast, the king swore an oath over 2 swans to avenge Comyn's death and the desecration of Greyfriars Church in Dumfries. Notable newly knighted nobles included Piers Gaveston, Hugh le Despencer, John de Warenne, 7th Earl of Surrey, Roger Mortimer, 1st Earl of March, and his uncle Roger Mortimer of Chirk. In the Middle Ages, unicorns frequently appeared in religious art, stemming from a translation error in the Greek version of the Old Testament, known as the Septuagint. Translators confused the Hebrew word re'em, wild ox, with the Greek monokeros, unicorn. As a result, the unicorn came to symbolize Christ, pure and elusive. Many medieval bestiaries and artworks depicted unicorns as symbols of purity and strength. Legend had it that only a virgin could tame a unicorn, which was interpreted as an allegory for the Virgin Mary's role in the conception of Christ and his later sacrifice. And that's all 25 fascinating facts about the Middle Ages you probably didn't know. Which one surprised you the most? What would you add to the list? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe.